October 4th, 1957. A faint radio signal cuts through the static of the night sky. Beep, beep, beep. It's coming from space, from a small metallic sphere no bigger than a beach ball. The Soviet Union has done the impossible. They've launched the first artificial satellite into orbit, Sputnik 1. For the first time in history, humanity has reached beyond the Earth, and for the first time the United States realizes it has fallen behind. The space race has begun. In the months that followed, panic swept through the West. Newspapers called it the Red Moon. Politicians warned of Soviet missiles that could now reach across the world. And in Moscow, inside the secret halls of the OKB-1 Design Bureau, the man who made it all happen, Sergei Korolev, the chief designer, was already thinking of the next step. If Sputnik 1 proved they could launch a machine into space, then Sputnik 2 would prove something far greater, that a living being could survive there. To Korolev, this wasn't about propaganda, at least not entirely. It was about survival. The Soviet Union's scientists knew that before they could send a human, they had to know what space would do to a body, to the heart, the lungs, the brain. But time was the enemy. In Washington, President Eisenhower announced that America would soon launch Project Vanguard. The Soviets needed to stay ahead, no matter the cost. So Korolev made a decision that would define the next century of space exploration. He ordered the construction of a new spacecraft, Sputnik 2, to be ready in less than a month. The design was rushed. There were no blueprints, no prototypes, no time for testing. The engineers worked around the clock in freezing Moscow workshops. They welded and cut metal by hand, improvising as they went. The spacecraft would be nearly 4 meters tall, fitted with a pressurized cabin, oxygen generators, a fan for air circulation, and primitive sensors to monitor heartbeat, breathing, and temperature. And in the center, a small compartment just large enough to fit a single dog. Korolev gathered his team. He told them what was at stake. They were not only racing against America, they were racing against time, against the limits of human knowledge. They had just weeks to prepare an animal to do what no living creature had ever done, leave Earth and never come back. The scientists knew what that meant. Sputnik 2 was not designed for recovery. There was no way to bring the passenger home. This mission was, from the beginning, a one-way trip. Still, orders were orders. The Kremlin wanted a launch by November 7, 1957, to mark the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Failure was not an option. And so, deep within a hidden facility outside Moscow, Institute of Aviation Medicine, the search for the first space traveler began. Not a pilot, not a cosmonaut, but a dog. In the cold winter of 1957, Moscow was a city of contrasts. Above the streets, propaganda posters promised a radiant future built by science. Below them, stray dogs wandered the alleys, unwanted, unseen, surviving off scraps and instinct. Among them was a small mixed-breed female, part terrier, part husky, barely 6 kilograms. Curled up beside a bakery vent for warmth, she had no name, no owner, no future. Until the day a van from the Institute of Aviation Medicine stopped nearby. Inside were military scientists with orders from the highest level of the Soviet government. Find dogs that could endure extreme stress, cold, hunger, confinement. They wanted strays, not pampered pets, animals used to hardship, creatures that could adapt, obey, and survive. The team captured several. Among them was that small white and brown dog from the bakery vent. In the records, she was first listed simply as number 3. Later, the handlers gave her a name. Laika. It meant barker. The selection. Back at the laboratory, Laika joined a dozen other dogs, all female, because the design of the spacecraft favoured smaller bodies and simpler waste systems. They were numbered, catalogued and examined endlessly. Heart rate, lung capacity, reflexes, obedience. Scientists tested how they responded to noise and motion, to being confined in small metal capsules. Those who panicked were removed. Those who endured stayed. Laika never resisted. She didn't bark or bite. She simply watched with calm, intelligent eyes. Her handlers later described her as quiet, gentle, and unusually trusting. That trust, they would come to realize, made her the perfect candidate, and the perfect tragedy. The training. The Soviet animal space program was brutal. The scientists were under unbearable pressure. Failure meant disgrace, possibly worse. Laika and the others were placed in progressively smaller cages for days at a time to simulate the spacecraft cabin. They were strapped into harnesses, fed only through tubes, and exposed to vibrations, heat, and the deafening roar of rocket engines played over loudspeakers. They spun in centrifuges to mimic acceleration. They sat in isolation chambers that mimicked orbit. Endless silence, broken only by mechanical clicks and whirring instruments. Some of the dogs refused food after days of testing. Others collapsed from exhaustion, but Laika endured. She adapted. She waited quietly for the next command. Her main trainer, a young woman named Adelia Kotovskaya, developed a deep attachment to her. She brushed her fur, whispered to her during tests, and called her Lyalka, a nickname meaning little doll. In her later memoirs, Kotovskaya wrote, "We loved her, we all did, but we also knew she would not come back." The final choice. By late October 1957, only 3 dogs remained: Albina, Mushka, and Laika. Albina had already completed high-altitude tests. She was the backup. Mushka was used for equipment checks. And Laika, calm, obedient, and photogenic, was chosen for the flight. She was brought to the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, where Sputnik 2 stood ready on the launch pad. In those last days, the handlers tried to make her as comfortable as possible. They petted her, fed her special gel food, and even let her play under the desert sun. Kotovskaya later recalled, "I wanted to do something nice for her. She had so little time left." When the time came, Laika was placed inside her small cabin, a metal sphere barely big enough for her to turn around. She was strapped into position, sensors attached, and her heartbeat began to echo across the control room monitors. Outside, the engines of Sputnik 2 waited to ignite. November 3rd, 1957, just 1 month after the first Sputnik had stunned the world. The dawn over Baikonur Cosmodrome was pale and bitterly cold. The ground shimmered with frost. Engineers and soldiers moved through the half-light, their breath rising like smoke. No one spoke much, not out of discipline, but because of the weight of what they were about to do. Inside the gleaming rocket, sealed within an airtight compartment no larger than a suitcase, Laika waited. Her pulse was already elevated, 103 beats per minute, the sensors showed. But she was calm, still, listening to the distant sounds of footsteps and machinery echoing through the hull. A few of her handlers stood nearby, their faces expressionless for the cameras. After the photo op, they stepped back quietly. One technician whispered, "Goodbye, little one." Then the hatch was sealed. The countdown. The rocket, Sputnik 2, wasn't designed to return. It was built in just 4 weeks, a rushed political project meant to outshine the United States after Sputnik 1. Every engineer knew it was a one-way flight. At 5:30 a.m., Moscow time, the engines ignited. A thunderous roar split the steppe. The entire sky seemed to tremble. From the ground, it looked like a new sun rising, a pillar of fire and smoke piercing the clouds. Inside the capsule, Laika's heart rate spiked to over 240 beats per minute. She whimpered once, a short startled sound, then went silent. The acceleration pinned her against the harness. 5, 10, 15 Gs. The noise, the vibration, the blinding heat. It was chaos. Then suddenly, stillness, weightlessness. Sputnik 2 had reached orbit. The world watches. Across the globe, radio stations interrupted their programming. The Soviet Union has launched a living creature into space. The announcement shook the Western world. In Washington, President Eisenhower was briefed before breakfast. In London, newspapers called it a triumph of science and a test of conscience. In Moscow, loudspeakers in Red Square declared it proof of Soviet superiority. No one outside the Soviet Union knew that the spacecraft had no recovery plan. It was impossible to bring Laika home. To the public, officials promised she'd be humanely euthanized after several days in orbit. But the truth was much harsher, alone in the sky. For a few hours, Laika orbited the Earth, becoming the first living being to do so. Her capsule circled the planet every 90 minutes, crossing over continents, oceans, and night skies where no life had ever travelled before. The sensors sent data back to mission control, breathing patterns, heart rate, temperature. At first, everything looked stable, but soon the cabin's temperature began to rise, a malfunction in the thermal insulation. Laika panted rapidly, Her heartbeat accelerated again, 260 beats per minute. Then gradually, it stopped. Within 5 to 7 hours after launch, she was gone, silent, weightless, alone above the Earth. For years, the Soviet Union maintained the official story that she lived for several days and was painlessly euthanized. The truth, that she died from overheating and panic soon after launch, was only revealed in 2002. But her death was not meaningless. Her mission, though tragic, paved the way for all human spaceflight that followed. Without Laika's sacrifice, Yuri Gagarin might never have orbited Earth 4 years later. When news of Laika's flight spread, the world was captivated. For the first time in history, a living creature had crossed the boundary of Earth's sky. To some, it was proof that humanity had entered a new era, that space was no longer unreachable, but to others, it was a story of cruelty disguised as progress, a triumph for the state. In Moscow, Sputnik 2 was celebrated as a monumental victory. Posters showed Laika's silhouette soaring among stars, her image painted beside rockets and flags. Children wrote essays calling her the bravest dog in the Soviet Union. The newspapers praised her as a hero of socialist science. Inside the Kremlin, Premier Nikita Khrushchev smiled for the cameras. The propaganda machine roared to life. To the Soviet public, Laika's mission wasn't just about science. It was about pride, dominance, and the idea that the USSR could conquer the heavens. No one dared to mention that Laika was never meant to return, not even the engineers who built the capsule. The hidden guilt. Behind closed doors, the scientists were shaken. Chief designer Oleg Gazenko, who had personally trained Laika, later admitted, "We did not learn enough from the mission to justify the death of the dog. He had grown fond of her, a stray he once described as quiet, obedient, and trusting." In her final moments, she had looked at him calmly as he sealed her in the capsule. That image haunted him for decades. Other scientists expressed regret too, though they kept silent during their lifetimes. They were patriots, working under immense political pressure. Failure was not an option, not when the eyes of the world and the wrath of the party were watching. They had built the rocket in less than a month, under orders that left no room for moral debate. There was no time to design a return system. It was a race, and races in the Cold War were measured not in ethics, but in victories. The Western reaction. In the United States and Europe, the news struck differently. While many admired the scientific achievement, others were horrified. Animal rights groups protested outside Soviet embassies, demanding to know how long Laika had survived. Cartoons in Western papers showed Laika peering down from orbit, surrounded by stars and tearful eyes below. Scientists debated the ethics of animal testing in a new light. Was the price of discovery worth the suffering it caused? The truth was, America had its own animal space programs. Monkeys, mice, even frogs were being prepared for flight. But Laika was the first to capture the world's imagination, and her suffering forced the public to confront what progress really meant. A silent orbit. For 5 months, Laika's capsule continued to circle the Earth. Each orbit took about 90 minutes, over 2,000 trips around the planet. Her remains drifted silently through space, a metal tomb reflecting sunlight over oceans and cities that would never know she was still up there. On April 14, 1958, the capsule finally re-entered the atmosphere. It burned brightly over the Caribbean, disintegrating in a streak of flame and ash. In that final blaze, the mission that had symbolized both human genius and human cruelty came to an end. Years passed. The Cold War intensified. New rockets launched. New nations joined the race, and humans at last followed where Laika had gone first. But her name, whispered at first only in propaganda, began to grow into something larger, something deeper. Laika became a symbol of courage, of innocence, and of the price of progress. The birth of space ethics, Laika's death changed how the world viewed animal testing forever. In the 1960s, as missions with monkeys, dogs, and rabbits continued, scientists began asking questions that had never been asked before. Should intelligence or sentience determine an animal's right to life? Is discovery worth the suffering of a creature that cannot choose? In the Soviet Union, these questions were rarely spoken aloud, but they lingered, even among those who had sent Laika to her fate. By the 1970s, both the USSR and the United States began enforcing animal welfare protocols for all space programs. Future missions were designed with return systems, life support, and safety procedures unthinkable in 1957. In many ways, Laika's sacrifice forced humanity to become more human. A symbol across generations. In Moscow, decades after the flight, scientists who once stayed silent began to speak. One of Laika's trainers, Adilia Kotovskaya, broke down in tears when she said, "We did not ask her if she wanted to go. We could not. That was our sin." Her honesty resonated across generations. Children who once saw Laika as a patriotic hero began to see her as a victim of circumstance, a loyal creature caught between ideology and discovery. Memorials were built, books were written. And in 2008, over half a century later, Russia unveiled a bronze monument in her honor outside the Military Research Center where she was trained. It showed Laika standing proudly atop a rocket that stretched toward the stars. But the expression on her face was not one of triumph, it was one of quiet dignity. Laika's true impact. Every astronaut who has since launched into orbit owes something to her. The life support systems, cabin designs, and biomedical monitoring used in early manned spaceflight all came from data collected on Laika's mission. Yuri Gagarin's historic 1961 flight, the first human orbit, was built directly upon the technology tested in Sputnik 2. Without Laika, Gagarin might not have survived. Without her, humankind's leap into space might have taken years longer. Her story became a bridge between the age of animals and the age of humans in space, between blind ambition and ethical awareness. A quiet redemption. Today, Laika's story is no longer just about a dog or a rocket. It's about what happens when humanity's reach exceeds its compassion, and what we learn when we finally admit our mistakes. As one Soviet scientist later said, Laika did not die in vain. She showed us that even in our race to the stars, we must never forget what it means to care. And so, as we look at the skies, at satellites, at the International Space Station, at the future of Mars, we remember that it all began with a small, frightened stray dog from Moscow who taught the world that courage can come from the most unexpected places,